Good day. This is my latest update on the crisis in Ukraine, or at least the crisis in and around Ukraine, which is now, of course, in some respects and in some of its manifestations, a global crisis, but which is in any event a crisis between the West and Russia. We are now on, I'm right in saying, the sixth day of this conflict, of the conflict that began last week with the Russian invasion, as most people are calling it, incursion, as the Russians say, or peace enforcement exercise, as the Russians like to say, in Ukraine. There are going to be talks apparently today between the Russians and the Ukrainians in Belarus. This will be the second occasion when talks of this nature are taking place. There's still rumbles and discussions about possible Chinese mediation. It's a topic I discussed in my previous video. Though I'm not a military person, from what I've been able to read, it appears that the military situation, the military balance, is shifting ever further in Russia's favor. The important port city of Kherson has fallen under Russian control. The key city of Mariupol is now surrounded, and it seems that the Ukrainian army in the Donbass is essentially surrounded. MS Badrakuma, the Indian journalist, has pointed out that it's curious how Western media is focusing overwhelmingly on the situation in Kiev, even though there is no bombing taking place there on any massive scale. There was an attack on a television and communications tower, but certainly nothing like the kind of bombing we've seen in other wars, and very little actual fighting, though the Russian military is gradually encircling the city. But regardless, the Western media are overwhelmingly focused on the situation in Kiev and to a lesser extent in Kharkiv, and continue to ignore the real battle, which is the battle that's going on in eastern Ukraine, where the Russians and their allies in the militias of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics are gradually closing the trap or cauldron or encirclement, whatever you want to call it, of the Ukrainian military there. And obviously that is a more difficult story to cover, and perhaps it's also a less attractive story to cover, but the fact remains that it is the important story as far as the battlefield, the actual battlefield, is concerned. People that I've spoken to who have an understanding of these matters, people with a military background, which I do not, or people who have experience analysing military affairs, are of the view that this war is now entering its decisive phase, unless the Ukrainians are able to extricate themselves from the trap very soon. It will be, to all intents and purposes, from a military point of view, game over. I would reiterate again, I'm not providing any timetable. I'm not in any position to. I have no idea what sort of timetable one should apply. And secondly, these are opinions that I've been provided. I'm not in a position to give judgments on military things. I've never pretended to any kind of military background and knowledge. But what I would say again is that this information, this advice seems to me both authoritative and informed, as well as reliable. And I say that because, to repeat again, 99% of what one reads about the conflict doesn't seem to me to be reliable at all. And whilst obviously the Western media has floated quite a lot of fantasy material, most of it in fact, most of its coverage seems to me to be largely fantasy material. I'm not going to acquit the Russians here. It seems to me that the Russian media has also been doing something of the same. Perhaps as I've said before, in an armed conflict, one should not expect otherwise. Anyway, while things in the Donbass, in Ukraine itself, seem to be approaching a conclusion, and whilst peace talks desultorily continue underway in Ukraine, perhaps awaiting that energizing shock which may come if we actually see a formal step taken by both sides to accept or request Chinese mediation. Whilst all of that is going on, we have the State of the Union address from President Biden. Now, all I'm going to say about that is that it seemed to me full of the usual words and commentaries that once upon a time were filled with meaning and substance, but which, because of so much misuse over so many years and because of constant stale repetition, have become drained of that substance and content. I didn't think he had anything interesting or important to say at all. He did float the possibility that all sanctions might be on the table, with the implication that that might include Russia's oil and gas exports. But shortly after, we got comments from Jen Psaki, the spokesman, the US spokesperson, who said that the United States would not be doing things which might backfire on itself, which strongly suggests that even the United States is now having second thoughts about imposing sanctions on Russia's oil and gas exports. And the reason for this is not difficult to understand. Russia is a pivotal player in the world oil and gas export industries. Already oil and gas prices are surging, as, by the way, are food prices, with both Russia and Ukraine critically important food exporters. Russia is the world's biggest exporter of wheat. Ukraine is the world's second biggest exporter of wheat. So imposing further sanctions of that nature on the oil and gas industries, the oil and gas export industries of Russia, what that would do, in my opinion, to the prices of these absolutely essential materials, commodities, it just doesn't even bear thinking about. And I hope nobody is foolish enough or reckless enough or irresponsible enough to go to that place. In the meantime, we have seen the European Union announce what the SWIFT sanctions are going to be. And importantly, two key Russian banks, Gazprom Bank and Sberbank, have been excluded from the SWIFT disconnection because Gazprom Bank is the bank which receives all the receipts for Russia's natural gas, and Sberbank is the bank which receives the receipts for Russia's export of its oil. Now, I would say that there are currently, apparently, difficulties getting Russian oil circulating around the world oil market, because with uncertainties about how far the sanctions will go, oil traders are at the moment extremely reluctant to touch Russian oil. A wise and sensible thing to do would be to reassure these oil traders that Russian oil is not going to be targeted for sanctions, in which case, presumably, with prices surging, they will once again start to trade it, which will cause oil prices, one would assume, to start stabilizing and perhaps falling again. But one can't, I'm afraid, any longer assume anything. It struck me that ever since that disastrous conference, the Munich Security Conference, which took place all of 2 weeks ago, the Western powers have, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, in sanctions terms, taken leave of their senses and have started to do things which are not only completely irresponsible, but which are disastrous for themselves. Suffice to say that they still talk about crippling the Russian economy, by which I presume they mean engineer a severe recession in Russia. Well, that's possible, though not certain, at least not on the scale that perhaps they expect. But it seems to me that in the meantime, they are running the very real risk of precipitating a severe recession in their own economies if they continue to go down this particular route. By the way, on the subject of Russia and its economy, I read an interesting article about this in Global Times, the Chinese newspaper, which said that judging from the sanctions the US imposed on other countries in the past, US economic sanctions based on its financial hegemony usually have a devastating impact on some countries that rely heavily on exports, while having a relatively limited impact on countries with high levels of self-sufficiency. Russia is highly self-sufficient across major commodities like energy, minerals and food, enabling to play an irreplaceable role in global industrial chains and supply chains. This is also why sanctions will probably not cripple Russia's economy, despite some financial turmoil. That is my view as well. It's also, by the way, the view of the Russian government. There was another meeting earlier today between Igor Belousov, who is the Deputy Prime Minister, the Russian Deputy Prime Minister in overall charge of the economy, and Russian business and industrial leaders, in which he said that he felt that the situation in the Russian economy was fully under control. Well, perhaps he would say that, but I suspect he's probably essentially right, as I suspect the Chinese commentary also is. By the way, I would also add that in any sane world, at some point, somebody in the West might perhaps want to consider whether the sanctions which were imposed over the weekend, specifically and most particularly the sanctions against the Russian Central Bank, were wise and sensible, and perhaps after all the hysteria begins to subside in a couple of months, perhaps there might be a quiet rowback on those particular sanctions with a view to trying to stabilize the situation in the world economy and in financial markets. I suspect that could be done without too much embarrassment and privately without too much open discussion. Well, we will see whether that happens. I suspect it will all very much depend on the direction of economic travel in the United States itself. Anyway, that's, it seems to me, where we are. A growing Russian offensive, broadening Russian offensive in eastern Ukraine, a situation where Ukraine's military position is looking incredibly precarious, negotiations going on in Belarus with a very uncertain outcome, and an economic war which may very well do damage to Russia, but risks doing extreme damage to the West and to the global economic system as well. Anyway, that's what I would say about those things. There is one specific point I do want to discuss and focus on in this program, and it's about all of this talk about once again standing militarily by Ukraine. And one particular feature of it was this absolutely bizarre idea floated by the EU's External Affairs Commissioner, Josep Borrell, to supply Ukraine with fighter jets, Soviet-era fighter jets, based from Eastern European former Warsaw Pact states, which would presumably engage the Russian Air Force from supposedly secure bases in Poland. Well, that was a crazy idea, as was the similarly crazy idea to try to impose a no-fly zone over the Russian Air Force in Ukraine. And the governments, the relevant governments, those of Poland, Bulgaria and Slovakia, rapidly moved to kill Borrell's idea. And the Pentagon and the White House and Congress, many important people in Congress, have also made it clear that the whole idea of no-fly zones over Ukraine is simply not there for the taking. It's not going to be pursued. It's far too dangerous, and nobody's going to try it against the military of Russia, a nuclear-armed superpower. So that brings us to a particular point that has been made by many people to justify the hard line that the West claims that it is taking against Ukraine. It's against Russia over the conflict in Ukraine. It has been repeatedly said, I've seen many people say this, that the West needs to take a hard line against Russia on Ukraine, because failure to do so would encourage China in any potential strike China might consider making against Taiwan. Well, if that is the rationale, then I'm going to say straight away that the reality is, it seems to me, the precise opposite. Because what's become very clear is that the Western powers are not able or willing to fight for Ukraine. If they're not able or willing to fight for Ukraine against a nuclear superpower like Russia, why would they be prepared to fight for Taiwan against another nuclear superpower, which is China? And the Chinese have taken note of this fact. There has already been a article in Global Times essentially mocking the United States for its inability to actually defend its so-called friends in the way that it claims. And I'm not going to read the whole article through. I don't particularly like articles that take a mocking tone. But suffice to say that the title is "Forget About Two Wars, US is Reluctant to Fight Even One." So there's no possibility of the United States fighting a two-front war against China and Russia at the same time. As events in Ukraine have shown, in reality and in practice, the United States is afraid to fight a one-front war against Russia, never mind take on either both Russia and China at the same time. And of course, far from this unnerving the Chinese, far from making them feel that there is deterred from launching a strike against Taiwan, well, of course, what it's doing instead is in effect encouraging them. It's making them feel that perhaps at the end of the day, the United States, in military terms, at least as far as Taiwan is concerned, is indeed the paper tiger that Mao Zedong, the former Chinese leader, once said it was. I am far from certain, by the way, that that is true. But anyway, the fact remains that the failure of the United States to take any kind of military step against Russia, a failure which, by the way, I strongly endorse. I think it would be madness to do otherwise. Well, all that's done is confirmed to the Chinese, or strengthen the opinion of the Chinese, that US commitments to Taiwan are a bluff. Now, that brings me to my last point, because it's a point I've made before. The United States has imposed sanctions on Russia to punish Russia, as it says, for its actions against Ukraine. It's not helping Ukraine at the moment very much. Might conceivably, I suppose the idea is that they might make Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership change their minds, but to be straightforward about it, I hardly think so. So given that that is so, given that the United States was not prepared to defend Ukraine, given that given that all its claims to be standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine have been exposed as a bluff, why lead Ukraine up the garden path? Why dangle NATO membership in front of it? Why talk about Ukraine joining the European Union, something which, by the way, the Financial Times has now said, despite Zelensky's latest request, the European Union is still most unlikely to agree to. Why dangle all of this in front of Ukraine, create a crisis with Russia for Ukraine, which, to be very clear, contains within it the very real possibility of destroying Ukraine as